So without further ado, I want to mention we're very excited to welcome this evening tonight's speaker, Gregory Dowell, PhD. Gregory wrote his doctoral dissertation several years ago on the subject of the Vail family and the Empire Ranch that they owned near Tucson before coming to the Temecula area. Dr. Dowell spent 3 years combing through the Vail Empire archives at the University of Arizona, and later spent several months in archives in LA going through legal documents and deeds. And historians who study the Vail family treasure their copies of Dr. Dowell's dissertation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Dowell.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Well, good evening. This was not what I expected to be doing tonight, except it is, because I've had the pleasure of having met members of the Vail family, and I came into this whole enterprise not knowing really what I was going to be doing with my life. And here we are standing at a place that has the name Vail. It is right alongside the Butterfield Trail. We are really at a place in history that matters, and matters to this region, but also matters to how Southern California developed in its cattle industry, as well as the economics of land and development throughout the Temecula Valley. And we had people that came west on the Butterfield Trail, and they began to discover the grasslands of this valley. They began to understand at the stage stops that there was something here that was very special. And you don't have to go far to find the name Vail in the Temecula Valley. It's everywhere. We are at, right now, the Vail Ranch. Not too far away from here, Vail Lake. There are housing developments named Vail that are around here, and then go over to the Grand Canyon State to the east. The city of Vail is 10,000 people strong, and there are every sort of business with the name Vail attached to it. So what in the world is this Vail thing all about? Is it, I don't know, is it a person, or is it a family, or an enterprise, or is it just an empire? And you know, it's all of those things. So the answer is that there was a gentleman 22 years of age that came west named Walter Vail. He was seeking fortune, but he didn't really know what he was going to be doing when he arrived. And so this man from New Jersey arrives first in Nevada. Looking at his vast holdings, you know, we can see why the name endures. He was clearly a leader in the cattle trade, but it would also be tempting to assume that when Walter arrived, that he had some grand vision of what he was going to do, that he had a plan. I would suggest otherwise. He was 22 years of age. He came west in a very unsettled time, and he was really searching for opportunity. And as he was willing to take chances where risk would lead to reward, he was coming out west not knowing, was I a rancher, was I a miner, there was even a point where he thought he might he might buy a structure in the city of Virginia City, Nevada, and maybe make it miners' homes. I mean, there were so many sides to this man that was 22 years of age. But his tiny 160-acre parcel that he eventually bought in Arizona was transformed into a true empire. And it was through hard work and him willing to adapt to changing financial conditions, as well as range conditions, And let's not forget the luck of a rancher who discovered silver on his property. But first, allow me to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Greg Dowell, and why should you listen to what I'm doing tonight? Well, 50 years ago, I was 22 years of age, and I was starting a graduate program at the University of Arizona. My major professor, Dr. Harwood P. Hinton, he challenged me to write a thesis. And rather than a couple of short scholarly articles. And I remember him saying, "Mr. Dowell, any serious historian writes a thesis." And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to write about. I had no idea. Well, he served up 2 or 3 very promising ideas. And then one of them was, he said, there's a lot of material over at the University of Arizona Special Collections and over at the Arizona Historical Society archives on this ranch that's southeast of here in southeast of Tucson. He says, I think there's enough there for you to get going. And I didn't know any better. And I said, yes. And it started me on a journey that brings me here today. Over the next 3 years, I dug into the ranching history of territorial Arizona. Manuscripts, correspondence, publications on mining, on livestock legislation, cavalry outposts, and the cultural influences that were shaping the latter half of the 19th century. Railroads, water rights, the shifting approaches to native inhabitants, and it all began to unfold into a story that became my master's thesis on the history of the Empire Ranch. This thing's got a lot of dust on it, by the way. So more importantly, I began to understand how uncertain yet bold Walter Vail was in his effort to carve out success in the West. It would be too simple to say he arrived with a vision. He didn't. He was searching for something to make a living out of at the exact same age I was when I was standing in Dr. Hinton's office at 22 years old. He was searching for success. And just as I said, what am I going to do? He said that too. Because for Walter and other young men venturing west, hard work on the rugged frontier of Arizona was not for the weak of heart. Isolation, Apache threats, and financial uncertainty was part of the landscape. Difficult as it was, it posed a rare opportunity for those who were willing to trade risk for reward. So Walter Vail must be viewed as an opportunistic young man with hopes, acting on every profitable opportunity the frontier offered. Walter paid close attention to the world around him. At 22 years of age, his first venture in the West placed him as the timekeeper at the California mine in Virginia City, Nevada. But in 1875, a series of bank failures restricted investment in the frontier mining. Believing his job was in jeopardy, Walter sought advice on opportunities from his uncle Nathan Vail, who, though living in Los Angeles, had many important contacts in the neighboring Arizona territory. One close friend, Governor Anson P.K. Safford, took an interest in young Walter, and he suggested that he take a look at some ranches southeast of Tucson. In August of 1876, Walter and an inexperienced English business partner named Herbert Hislop purchased Edward Nye Fish's 160-acre Empire Ranch, what was then just a 4-room adobe, and 612 head of cattle. The obstacles to success were many. Uncertain rainfall, livestock prices that ranchers had little control over. The reluctance of East Coast bankers and financial institutions to invest in what they viewed as the speculative enterprise of ranching in territorial Arizona. The threat of life and livestock by Chiricahua Apaches, who it was real until General Nelson, 10 years later, forced Geronimo's surrender in September of 1886. And so there was a lot of unpredictability. The unpredictability of markets for beef with the U.S. cavalry and boom and bust mining towns. That created another level of risk. You can imagine the uncertainties that young Walter and Herbert Hislop had and struggled with. Fortunately, favorable rains during their first 2 seasons owning the empire led to a steady increase in the empire's herds, nearly tripling to 1,500 head after 2 years. But money was tight. Money was tight. Vail and Hislop had even taken on a third partner, John Harvey, to help fund their investment. Opportunity presented itself every time a neighbor who, tired of the isolation of being far from cavalry or people, decided to pull up stakes and sell their properties. And the English Boys outfit, as they were known, had begun buying up adjacent acreage almost from the very start. First by purchasing the quarter acre or the quarter section next to Cienega Creek. Then filing on springs and seeps in Empire Gulch to control the nearby ranges. And I think that's important because we always think in terms of what we do with real property now. Then it was federal land, undeveloped, and the only way you controlled the ranges was to control the water. So they were filing on springs and seeps that fed into the land, and they could graze their cattle far and wide around it without actually having to own all the property. That's at the very start of their journey. But Hislop grew restless of Walter's reluctance to sell cattle until the herds had had several more calf crops. Frustrated by Vail's cautious finances, Hislop decided he'd had enough of the long hours and the few comforts of living on the ranch. And in 1878, he sold his share to Vail for $6,850 and headed back to England, swearing never to return to this bloody country again. Walter borrowed the money to buy out his partner from his Aunt Anna and Uncle Nathan Vail. They are critical to how you look at what has happened because they were really the financial engine that helped them at the very start. He could never have known how fully his fortunes, though, were about to change. Because on January 16th of 1879, John Harvey and a cowhand named John T. Dillon rode out along the boulder-strewn side of the Empire Mountains, about 30 miles southeast of Tucson. Dillon had been prospecting in the area for over a year, and he'd been poking around any granite and quartz formations that looked pretty interesting on the eastern slope. But on this day, they veered in the direction of a ragged outcropping of loose hardscrabble. And it left Dillon so unimpressed that he said, "The whole damned hill is a total wreck." Well, the three riders paused long enough to look closer, and they found formations that appeared to bear traces of silver. Vail posted location notices on 3 sites: the Justice, the Khyber, and, at Harvey's suggestion, the Total Wreck. They registered the names in the Pima County Recorder's Office in Tucson, and they hired 2 prospectors to do $100 worth of work to maintain the claims. Well, the Khyber claim proved worthless, and the Justice pinched out after only a few feet of promising silver. The prospectors then widened an opening around the total wreck site, and they sunk a shaft along a mineral ledge that started with some moderate concentrations of silver, but it contains so much iron oxide that Harvey suggested turning the total wreck into a paint mine. But as the shaft grew deeper, they hit rich concentrations of silver, and the promise of the claim became apparent. For all the excitement, the sobering fact was that Vail, Harvey, and Dillon didn't have funds to launch a full-scale mining operation. They would need to build a mill to process ore on site if they hoped to make it profitable. And adding to the financial burden, a raft of legal challenges put a stranglehold on their already limited resources. A combination of prospectors and lawyers filed suit in district court in 1880, challenging their ownership, alleging that Vail, Harvey, and Dillon had relocated claim markings that they had made just months earlier on the exact same spot. Led by Tucson attorney Thomas the Silver-Tongued Orator Fitch, a ragged and sometimes vulgar contingent of plaintiffs petitioned the court to quiet claim in their favor. Dillon couldn't afford to stay in the case. After all, he was a simple itinerant ranch hand working at the Empire. Changes in ownership brought Walter Vail's Aunt Anna and husband Nathan into a major role in the stalled mine. Nathan Randolph Vail was an eclectic entrepreneur willing to act decisively whenever he saw a chance to make a dollar. In earlier years, Uncle Nathan had patented and sold rails for trolleys in Dublin and London. He invested in coal, iron, and steel operations in Southern California, a Nova Scotia bank, and even an English cigar machine company. Nathan represented that hard-boiled determinism of frontier investors during the Gilded Age. He was not about to let a band of legal extortionists stand in the way of his opening the mine. But the delay worked to the advantage on several fronts. In April of 1880, the Southern Pacific Railroad laid tracks through the tiny Pantano Ranch, just 5 miles north of the total wreck. Nathan personally financed the construction of a wagon road from the Pantano, the railhead, past the total wreck to the Empire Ranch House, and then further to mining operations at Harshaw Camp to the south. The mine, if it would ever go into full production, now had a path to move silver to market. Well, while the bitter litigation crept through the courts, Uncle Nathan opened a new funding strategy. He leveraged the undeveloped potential of a silver mine by incorporating the Total Wreck Mining and Milling Company in New York State on February 21st of 1881. The owners exchanged their partnership shares for equivalent shares in the new corporation, and then just months later, Harvey sold his interest in both the mine and the Empire Ranch to Walter Vail, and he moved to New York. And through a friend of Nathan's, Isaac in Requa, they sold half of the stock to members of the New York Produce Exchange. With fresh capital, the Vails beat back that first round of legal challenges, and the plaintiffs withdrew charges in December of 1881. Encouraged by the settlement, Walter and Nathan drew up plans to begin mining operations. Well, they asked Walter's, I can go back. Well, they asked Walter's older brother, Edward, to leave his position as a cowhand at the Empire Ranch and step in as assayer for the total wreck. As Edward later recalled, his uncle said, we want someone we can trust as our assayer. And so he arranged for Edward to spend 6 months training with the chief assayer of the contention mine in Tombstone, Arizona, a man named Robert Wade. And after 6 months, Wade told Edward, well, you can do anything we're doing here, so you might as well save on your hotel bill and go back to the total wreck. And he did. And in the following months, activity erupted at the mining site. The total wreck hit richer deposits as the shaft sank deeper at a depth of 350 feet with 3 levels underground. Workers hauled out 50 tons of ore a day. The Vail's hurried construction on the mill and the hoist, and they ran a 600-foot tramway from the mine to the mill site. In March, workers installed a massive steam-powered hoist above the main shaft, and they began operating a 1-ton ore car between the surface and the below underground levels. Above ground, Edward laid out 71 town lots in a grid work on an adjacent claim site, and he speculated in the brisk sale of real estate at the new total wreck camp. But prosperity brought on one last legal assault, this time from the Star Lode and Company, consisting of who else but the same discredited prospectors from the prior lawsuit, and who else but their esteemed attorney, Thomas the Silver-Tongued Orator Fitch. With the Total Wreck Mining and Milling Company now deeply invested, Nathan bitterly agreed to the legal blackmail, and he settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The Star Lode and Company dropped their claim, and the Federal Land Office granted final patent approval on the site. But the mill and the town site needed a reliable water supply. Walter, with characteristic foresight, turned to a bold solution with profound implications both for the empire and for the Total Wreck mine. On November 10th of 1882, he purchased the Don Sanford Meadow Valley Ranch, borrowing a staggering $80,000 from Aunt Anna to complete the sale. That's a lot of money. The new property extended the empire 5 miles further north on Cienega Creek and thereby doubled the size of the empire's ranges. Walter installed a 40-horsepower pump on the creek 2 miles east of the total wreck and pushed water through a 6-inch iron pipe uphill to 2 50,000-gallon redwood tanks that they built just east of town. The Total Wreck finally cranked into full production. In spring of 1883, its first ore shipment to New York included 7 150-pound bars of silver, 90% fine, and valued at $20,000. Newspapers devoted regular coverage to the Total Wreck, heralding it as second to none on the Pacific coast. Population in Total Wreck camp swelled to over 300. Company profits moved up to $4,100 each day, and it increased production through mid-year, and it led the company to declare a dividend of $50,000 on May 10th, half of which went to the Vails. And for Walter, it was a welcome relief to finally repay some of the promissory notes to Aunt Anna. Looking down from the hilltop, the cacophony of sounds and activity was truly staggering. No boomtown in Pima County rivaled the excitement at Total Wreck Camp. Among the 50 houses and structures neatly laid out along the Toll Road, Dillon Street, and Lenox Street were dining halls, a blacksmith shop, a stable, carriage house, Davidson's groceries, 3 miners' bunkhouses, 3 Chinese laundries, and most importantly, 4 saloons and a brewery. Walter and Edward fed the hungry miners day and night with Empire Ranch beef that stocked Edward Vail's butcher shop in the town of Total Wreck. The Vails, they operated the bank and the lumber yard, and miners and cowboys and prospectors from throughout the newly christened Empire District poured into town for drinking, gambling, and the sort. As Edward later recalled, all the towns were wide open at that time. But it was an orderly camp, and to my knowledge, no one was ever killed in a gunfight, although there were several narrow escapes from such tragedies. Let's see. But as was often the case in the boom and bust arc of such bonanza mines, the life of the Total Wreck took an abrupt turn in June of 1883. The rich silver that characterized its early production began to pinch out. As rumors filtered back to New York stockholders in the Total Wreck Mining and Milling Company, they panicked and they dumped their shares. And inside of 2 weeks, the value of the shares dropped from $10 a share to $1 a share. Walter, Nathan, and their friend Ian Requa snapped up the depreciated stock, buying it back the entire issue and essentially returning the company to a private corporation. The remaining days of the dying mine alternated between declining assays and momentary rich discoveries that rarely played out very long. But by the middle of 1886, just 2 years later, silver prices were in free fall nationally, as fear mounted over the demonetization of silver. The Coinage Act of 1873 had begun a 20-year depreciation in the value of silver, no longer requiring the mint to produce silver coinage as the standard of American currency. A decade later, just as the Total Wreck was struggling with declining ore yields, the weakening prices of silver only accelerated problems for the Vails. Finally, when silver prices that had been $1.14 an ounce tumbled again in September of 1887 to 94 cents an ounce, the Vails called it quits. Requa bought out his partners, and he never succeeded in opening the mine or mill again. Bonanza mines and the camps that work them follow a predictable arc when the life cycle is eclipsed. The population drifted away to prosperous mines elsewhere. Lumber was too precious on the frontier to waste, so Total Wreck Camp's buildings were carted away intact, either to soon-to-be other ghost towns, or even back to the Empire Ranch itself. In November of 1890, the Postal Service ended, and that same year, the Total Wreck Mining and Milling Company failed to meet property taxes. Walter Vail bought back the property at a delinquent tax sale the following April for $630. Yeah. So the story of ranching in territorial Arizona cannot be told without the rich history of Walter Vail's Empire Ranch. And the history of the Empire's march from a 160-acre plot to a multi-state breeder-feeder operation cannot be told without the meteoric history of a mining camp with an amusing name that graced its northern flank. The total wreck pumped $500,000 into the Pioneer family's expanding cattle enterprise, and accounting for the changing value of money, today that would be the equivalent of $16 million that Walter used to purchase better bloodlines, adjacent properties, and to file on the available springs and seeps that fed the water throughout his grasslands of southern Arizona. The fortunes pulled from the ground and from supplying those who worked what was under the ground made investment possible on a large scale for Walter Vail during the 80s. As the 80s drew to a close, new challenges arose. Overgrazing in Arizona's southern ranges depleted ground cover as the territory was gripped by drought. Walter and his new partner, Carol W. Gates, shifted range focus to areas outside of Arizona to fatten their cattle closer to markets in Los Angeles and Kansas City. A bold cattle drive in 1890 to break the Southern Pacific Railroad's stranglehold on shipping prices convinced Vail and Gates of the importance of outside ranges. And just like the property at Warner Ranch, right down the road, and near current day Temecula, right here. During those difficult drought years, the empire, which way am I going? You're okay. No, I'm one off. No, I'm not. Well, during those difficult drought years, the empire transformed fully into a breeder-feeder operation where purebred cattle were raised on the Arizona range and then shipped as yearlings or 2-year-old steers to properties to fatten in California, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Through careful investments, they leased or bought land with better ground cover and closer to the markets, and they were no longer depending on the cavalry or mining camps for their markets. In the 90s, Vail joined in several partnerships where rangeland was available for final fattening before steers went to slaughter. Unfortunately, drought in Southern California in 1892 and 1893 pressed Vail's herds, and they looked for additional rangeland. In 1894, Vail and Gates bought stock in the Chiricahua Cattle Company from J.V. Vickers, who owned pasture land in Sherman County, Texas. Together, Vail, Gates, and Vickers formed the Panhandle Pasture Company, running 1- and 2-year-old steers on 14,000 acres of Texas and Oklahoma land. As drought persisted, Vail looked for other ways to bring fattened cattle to market. Walter never stopped innovating, and he adapted to the conditions that he faced. In 1891, he invested along with an LA businessman named Richard Gerd, an Arizona pioneer that he knew, and they opened a sugar beet operation in Chino. They would feed cattle, and they found that the cattle fed well with sugar beet pulp as well as local hay. And that is the site now of the current Chino, California. And that was where Vail fattened cattle, getting ready to take them to market in Los Angeles. In the 90s, Walter leased Catalina Island from William W. Banning. He leased the Warner Ranch and bought a portion of it east of here. Then they bought the Santa Rosa Island, as well as 87,000 acres of former Mexican land grants that we are now sitting part of, the Pauba, the Santa Rosa, Temecula, and the Little Temecula Ranchos. This was critical to their success. Drought years were not sustainable for the kinds of cattle that they were running. And these new ranges allowed for Vail's mature ranching enterprise to continue to succeed in the 90s. Rich grassland on Southern California's coastal region and islands allowed purebred steers to fatten. After clearing the sheep from those ranges, cattle could roam and fatten with certainty and with not needing as much additional support from vaqueros and others to maintain their herds. As you can see, they would bring cattle. This is one of my favorites right here. Looking at the cattle coming in on the boat, and I love that we have cattle the last 100 yards. They didn't have a pier to start with. So the cattle had to be jumping off the ship and taking that last 100 yards in on their own. And I know from one of the experts in this room that it was successful and they very rarely lost anything to drowning. So, so Walter's vast holdings and land investments made him a recognized leader in the Los Angeles business community. In 1895, Walter built a palatial residence at 720 Burlington Avenue in Los Angeles, and his family of 8 moved to LA, taking the corporate headquarters there the following year. The Warner and the old Mexican land grants around Temecula remained part of their extensive cattle enterprise well into the 20th century. But Walter only enjoyed the benefits for a few years. On November 30th of 1906, Walter stepped from a streetcar in downtown Los Angeles and was struck by a streetcar going the other way. Oops. Yeah, he succumbed to his injuries days later. Carol Gates managed the many properties in the wake of the tragedy until the estate could be settled among the surviving family members 2 years later. Walter's survivors managed the extensive properties, including the Vail headquarters that we are now in, until 1929, when most of the properties were sold to the Chiricahua Ranches Company, represented by Henry and Frank Boyce. Santa Rosa Island prospered as a Vail and Vickers property until the island became part of the Catalina Channel Islands National Park in the 1980s. So here we stand at Vail Ranch, the headquarters here in Temecula, a testament to the recognized giant that Walter Vail was in the cattle industry. The name Vail is festooned across the valley just as it is in southeastern Arizona. In 2018, Walter Vail was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. I was honored to join many members of the Vail and Boyce families for this posthumous honor, including 2 who are here tonight. Little did I know 50 years ago that I would play a role in giving a voice to Walter Vail's monumental achievements, and how important a bustling, though short-lived bonanza mine with a funny name was to making his empire a reality. And I thank you for letting me tell you this story again tonight. Does anybody have a question? Bill?
How big was the Empire Ranch? How many acres?
Well, that's a question that is hard to answer because at different times they own so much. The number 1 million acres comes up quite often. I think that's fair. Certainly they controlled more than that in the various properties, thinking about properties that included Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, their Arizona ranch, as well as what they leased or bought here in the Temecula Valley, and then the islands. It's a big number. I don't have a real good answer because I don't know that at any one time there was a good answer. But he was so recognized in the industry that he became, as well as just a businessman who understood management. In 1906, in April, there was something happened in California. There was an earthquake that leveled San Francisco. And he was selected as the person to direct the refugee activities from Southern California. That's how important he was. He ran the refugee camps in the Los Angeles area for people coming down that were dispossessed from their homes in San Francisco. So that important. Yes,
Were you a speaker when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in Oklahoma?
I did not speak.
Oh, they missed out.
Ah, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Actually, I got two questions. First one is the name of the mine, Total Wreck. I mean, it's a very curious name. I was just thinking when you mentioned it, I thought, man, that would be a great name for a racehorse. You know, I mean, is it? Do you have any background on where the name came from?
It came from Harvey, John Harvey, when they discovered the three claims. He looked at the whole hillside and he said, the whole damn hill's a total wreck. And,
So it's just
and they tagged it. It could have been one of the other three, but that was the one that prospered. Yes.
And the other question I had is, I know silver's fungible. The silver that came out of the mine, is it known at all if any of it ever got minted into coins, like into silver dollars? Because I like collecting Morgan silver dollars. I just wonder if maybe one of them I have maybe came out of that mine. Thank you.
Just tell your friends it did. Okay. Well, one other thought was that there really wasn't a concerted effort to remine the area. In 1917, Edward Vail returned to the Total Wreck mine to mine wolfenite, which is an oxidized form of lead. And he did it for his brother's heirs, the Vail companies at that point. The Vail company built a small furnace to process the ore into wolfenite concentrates for use in World War I. And then Edward closed the plant 2 years later when the wartime demand dropped off. And the last reported work at the Total Wreck was in 1928 when several thousand tons of ore tailings were reworked to try and bring more value back. So that was the last we know of the Total Wreck.
Did Aunt Anna ever get paid back?
I would have to say yes. Because we lose, it's kind of interesting because earlier tonight, Whitney was showing me canceled checks that Walter Vail had paid back or paid money out. And you think about how much was financed, but Walter wanted to get rid of the debt load as quickly as possible. And it was tempting to bring cattle to market ahead of when they could exploit the fact that they were going to be having calves, and that's more for the future. So there was a balance between how quickly can we pay off the promissory notes. Thank goodness the silver mine brought money into the picture in a major way. But I don't know exactly. I looked at those ledgers 50 years ago. So, and it was confusing to begin with because I kept thinking I'm seeing money going out, and I hear him talking about money going the other way, but I didn't see the canceled checks until tonight. So anyway, I think Anna was compensated well. Nathan Vail died in 1888, I think. They were involved in so many different investments. And one of them was land investments in Southern California. Nathan Vail had been one of the directors of a syndicate investing in what is now Redondo Beach. And while Redondo Beach was just a town site on paper, and with a wharf, Nathan went out on a small skiff and it capsized and he drowned. So, so that was the end of his involvement, but Anna lived into the 20th century.
Really appreciate the presentation. Really interesting. Obviously, very topical for us. And thank you for choosing to be here with us tonight. All righty. So, everybody, next presentation, fourth Monday, once again, will be March 23rd. And then on the 22nd, once again, 2 p.m., we'll have a special Sunday presentation. Thank you for being here tonight, and we're grateful for everybody's attendance. Have a great evening. All right. Thank you.